February 2021, a cargo ship was on its way to Hamburg. Dutch investigators had their eye on 5 containers. They suspected cocaine smuggling. They alerted German customs officials who took the containers to a special facility and x-rayed them. One of them contained cans of building material. Hidden inside, hundreds of packages of cocaine, a total of 16 tons. It was the largest haul ever found in Europe.
At least 17 million euros in advance payments must have been made for the cocaine in South America.
The trail led to Paraguay. A front company had been formed there to allow the traffickers to package and ship the cocaine undisturbed, a scheme that was worth the effort.
The pure product has a street value of over 1 billion euros.
In most cases, the cocaine is thinned down to make 3 times as much. So a 17 million euro investment could have become 3 billion in profit. Such margins make drug trafficking the most important area of organized crime. Around the world, investigators scramble to keep up while year after year, estimated drug sales increase.
Organized crime has become a multi-billion-dollar industry over time in ways that perhaps was unthinkable 40, 50 years ago.
The profits can be used to buy weapons, bribe politicians, and finance terrorism.
Every time somebody thinks that there's nothing wrong in snorting a line of cocaine at a Saturday night party, you're funding death in Central America, in Brazil, and ultimately in the Middle East.
In October 2018, Chief Prosecutor Wolfgang Zollner was preparing to clamp down on organized crime in Hamburg. He wanted to break up a ring of cannabis dealers.
While the officers were being briefed, someone realized that of all things it was the day of the Hamburg Derby game, Hamburg against St. Pauli.
The soccer match would be occupying too many officers, so arresting the dealers was postponed. Surveillance continued.
We hoped our undercover work might lead us to catching a deal as it happened.
Under surveillance, the suspects rented a white van.
We assumed the van meant that a few boxes of marijuana would be coming. The plan was to immediately arrest anyone putting anything into the van.
The van drove to a port terminal. Several men got out. They were interested in one specific container.
They had the electronic shipping documents. They knew which container number they were after.
How did the men get such precise information?
We know port workers are paid mid-5-figure sums for this, because it's no help if the container with trafficked goods is on top of 2 others and no one can reach it.
When a truck picked up the container, the suspects followed in their white van, outfitted like the police.
They had handcuffs. They had police equipment like a blue light and a signaling wand to flag someone down.
Investigators followed the truck and the van. South of Hamburg, they both turned and drove back toward the city. The police tried to figure out why.
They determined that a driver swap had apparently taken place. That caused a stir amongst the investigators.
The truck had apparently been hijacked. A police helicopter tracked the convoy back to the port, where the truck was unloaded.
They watched for a while, then they gave the go-ahead.
A mobile unit arrested several suspects who had repacked hundreds of packages from the hijacked truck into bags. Inside was cocaine, a total of 1,100 kilos. Some of the arrested suspects cooperated with police. They claimed to have been hired specially for this operation. If their clients couldn't get the cocaine any other way, they were to hijack the truck and the container. They were Plan B.
Even without doing anything, they would have each gotten 10,000 euros, according to their own statements.
Authorities also arrested the leader, one of the heads of Hamburg's Hells Angels. This job, though, was organized independently of the bikers. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In court, he admitted to hijacking the truck, but kept silent about whom he was working for.
No suspect would give information about the others involved, those the investigators hadn't found. There's another structure there, but we couldn't uncover it.
Professional criminal structures often remain shadowy. They divide up their labor and quickly adapt to new situations.
Everything that constitutes a major problem in the fight against organized crime can be summed up as this. There's a big misunderstanding among the public and politicians about the dimension of organized crime. Hardly any politician in the German Bundestag is aware that we're talking about 4,000 to 5,000 organized crime groups in Europe.
In Germany, the focus on organized crime mostly spotlights so-called clans, often groups of Arab descent.
It's obvious that the only reason the political debate is dominated by so-called clan crime is because they are among the dumber of these groups, the ones that cause trouble on the streets. I see it in our own ranks. How much personnel do we have to put into raids, and then afterwards into examining suspects' mobile devices and so on? Meanwhile, it's highly likely that the more professional organized crime groups are laughing themselves to sleep because they then continue to fly under the radar.
The really big fish only find themselves in the spotlight when they murder people, like in Duisburg in 2007, when 6 mafiosi were killed.
To put it bluntly, I can tell it only gets public attention when there are dead bodies in the streets, like we had in Duisburg a few years ago.
In May 2019, an unknown perpetrator shot 2 men in a house in the small town of Forst, near the eastern German city of Cottbus. In the public sphere, the case went nearly unnoticed. The victims were 2 members of a drug gang from Montenegro. Police quickly determined the attack was carried out by a professional killer. The victims' gang was engaged in bitter fighting with another Balkan clan over market share. There were deaths in Amsterdam, in Malaga, in Athens, and especially in the Balkans.
Maybe I look young, but actually I'm pretty long into this job, and actually 12 years in investigative reporting.
He shows us a crime scene in Serbia. The man killed here was a member of one of the feuding drug clans, originally from the town of Kotor in Montenegro. Footage shows the man driving into a garage. 2 men appear and open fire. Sitting next to the victim was a policewoman who wasn't injured. Even Serbian police are also entangled in the gang war.
We are in Vračar, it's part of the Belgrade. A lot of mafia murders took place recently here. It is because it's a very rich area and a lot of mafia members buying real estates here.
Organized crime spread rapidly in Serbia after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc.
Our first democratic leader, the one of the men who actually took down Milosevic, was killed in 2003 by organized crime group. The gang that was smuggling drugs teamed up with parts of the secret services. They killed him with a sniper shot. This shows the power of the organized crime.
For years, Dojinovic and his team of journalists have tried to shed light on Serbia's criminal underworld, including the current gang war.
At least 50 people that we know for sure that are killed connected to these wars of these gangs.
The feud began over a drug shipment. One gang accused the other of stealing cocaine. The amount was comparatively small.
They got in fight for 200 kilos of cocaine. 200 kilos really, for Balkan terms of these gangs, is not much drugs.
Gangs are fixtures of the global cocaine trade. They hire professional hitmen.
These gangs have some people who provided for them some like really perfect silicone masks, which when you put on yourself, you really cannot recognize as a mask. It really look like human face. They're not even afraid if the camera captures them and they commit murder because they get police confused.
The Balkan Mafia also gets its cocaine direct from South America. In June 2019, nearly 20 tons were seized in Philadelphia. The group from Montenegro had bought the drugs from a South American cartel.
They don't really care much about street-level distribution. They just sell big amounts of drugs to another European gangs.
These Balkan godfathers don't just export large amounts of cocaine, they trade in killing too. Vienna 2018, just before Christmas. A contract killer ambushed two men as they left a restaurant. One died, the other was seriously injured. The men belonged to a hostile Serbian drug clan. Once again, the perpetrator left no trace. 3 years later, the Vienna murders have still not been solved, and the killing continues. Specialists from the United Nations are headquartered in Vienna. What makes the cartels so dangerous and powerful is something Italian Angela May has spent years analyzing.
One advantage is that they have no accountability. So governments are accountable to the people, and so they have to operate according to certain standards. They don't have those standards, so they can operate without asking permission. They use any kind of method, not only violence, but also the way how they control their territory, etc., that makes them stronger, and there is no government can beat them on that.
The United States has certainly tried, beginning with Richard Nixon in 1971.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
The superpower went to war with drug cartels. One battleground was Colombia. The U.S. sent soldiers and money. Dealers were hunted down, coca fields poisoned, crops burned. But even 50 years of fighting couldn't hurt business.
Drugs remain the most profitable illicit market for organized crime, and by far the one that really produced most of the profit for organized crime.
Organized crime has an annual turnover of up to $2 trillion. Drug trafficking alone brings in up to $700 billion. Each year, U.S. authorities record hundreds of boats bringing cocaine from Colombia to Mexico. From there, the product is smuggled into the United States, the world's biggest market. Cocaine has changed Mexico.
At the beginning, when the government tried to address the issue of the trafficking and of the organized crime, then the violence exploded.
Pressure from the Mexican government has had unfortunate consequences.
That disruption had reduced the amount of cocaine that was transferring from Mexico. And so that created tension within the group because they were fighting for a smaller piece of the cake. Mexico has really paid the highest price in terms of violence.
For years, it's been mainly civilians paying that price, like in the province of Veracruz. Since 2007, 27 journalists have been murdered here. They had reported on the crimes of cartels and corrupt politicians. One of them was Maria Elena Ferral. Her daughter Fernanda grew up amid danger.
The first time it happened, I was 6. My mother was being threatened. And since then, we always had bodyguards. We had bodyguards for 14 years. She always prepared me for the day when something might happen to her.
Despite the threats, her mother spoke out against a corrupt and influential local politician. In March 2020, she was shot in front of her car. The subsequent protests fell on deaf ears. Once more, Fernando was protected by bodyguards. She wants to continue her mother's work.
First, they took me away from my home and from the things that were familiar to me. They took me from my work, the place where I spent most of my life. It had a huge impact on me because now I'm not even allowed to say where I am. I can't do anything here, and I can't work as a journalist anymore.
When Fernanda and her brother visited their old home, killers were waiting for them.
I was on my way back from Papantla. I had gone there because it was my mother's birthday the day before, and I wanted to visit her in the cemetery. Suddenly, a pickup truck closed in on the car, and they started shooting at us. I didn't see anything after that because my bodyguards were covering me.
She continues to live in fear. Those who ordered her mother's murder have not been caught. In the summer of 2021, Fernanda ran for parliament in Mexico and has raised awareness for the families of murder victims. Since 2006, 125,000 people have died in Mexico's drug war. Drugs are smuggled from South America directly to the US and Europe, but also to West Africa. Mali is an important transit hub. Here, UN troops try to push back Islamist militias. But those militias are growing increasingly powerful because they make money from cocaine smuggling, as a UN expert discovered.
I was asked by the UN to spearhead a project. What we found out was most of the organized crime groups operating in Latin America who are trying to get cocaine to Europe, they have to pass through historical transit routes or trade routes in parts of Africa. And it's impossible for those criminal groups to get the drugs to Europe without actually paying taxes to various terrorist groups along the way.
In particular, groups with ties to Al-Qaeda are profiting from drug trafficking in West Africa.
The law enforcement personnel will actually just kind of look away because they'll get paid a lot more by these particular groups because they're a lot more powerful. In certain parts of the world, it's getting to a point now where it's hard to see how this can be countered effectively.
The UN mission is becoming more and more difficult. In the summer of 2021, a patrol of German troops was attacked in Mali. Terrorists in East Africa, too, are making money from drug trafficking. Here, it's not about cocaine, but heroin, smuggled from Afghanistan and on its way to Europe. In the Mediterranean, European ships are picking up drug smugglers. In June 2020, Italian investigators seized a shipment of Captagon. The stimulant had been trafficked by the so-called Islamic State. Its street value, 1 billion euros. Here in Vienna, UN experts know how dangerous it is when drugs and terror mix. Northern Irishman Neil Walsh is an analyst and ex-police officer.
When I was 11 or 12, I was standing in a clothes shop with my dad on a Saturday morning, and suddenly the windows came in, there was this enormous bang. We went out into the street, there were people lying dead in the street.
For decades, British soldiers in Northern Ireland fought against the separatist IRA. The group financed itself through organized crime.
Certainly in my law enforcement career, working in the UK and at Europol in The Hague, intelligence and evidence all the time showing the links between organised criminals and terrorists. It's always been there.
The IRA feared informants and traitors. Contact with criminals was considered a risk.
Terrorist organizations then insulate themselves from risk, and their own members figure out how to engage in extortion, kidnapping for ransom, drug trafficking, etc. And that, makes them less vulnerable. And we've called it DIY organized crime, do it yourself.
The IRA liked to present itself as a political and moral force. However, disagreements among members splinter its message. One subgroup made a show of taking on drug traffickers, while members of another were linked to large-scale cocaine trafficking. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, officially ending the conflict with the IRA more than 20 years ago.
I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this.
But despite the peace, old habits die hard.
Whichever group you're looking at, whether it's an active dissident group or a group who's agreed to the peace, even if it's only temporary, they all need finance for propaganda, for recruitment. They pay salaries to their members. They even pay pensions to their members who have retired.
To maintain power, both sides smuggled cigarettes, weapons, and even people, a multi-million-dollar business in Northern Ireland.
All of the groups, they all continue to engage in different levels of organised crime to continue their funding streams. This is not confined to the UK or to Europe even. This is on a global scale. We even uncovered some links between paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland and the Middle East through money laundering.
A used car dealership on the outskirts of Düsseldorf, its Lebanese-born owner used the unassuming business to launder hundreds of thousands of euros. Until his arrest in 2018, he was a key figure in the world of money laundering.
You had used car businesses that were using the used cars, they were trading to move cocaine across Europe, right? Schengen area. You pack cocaine in hidden compartments of a car. You drive from Germany to Spain, from Spain to France. They were moving cash the same way.
The dealer had long been under surveillance by German and American authorities. They watched him use drug money to buy cars in Europe, which he then sold in West Africa. Until his arrest, he was in contact with the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah. Hezbollah is backed by Iran. It controls parts of Lebanon, is active in Syria, and even fought a war with Israel. The constant violence prompts thousands of Lebanese people to leave the country. They migrate to Africa, Europe, and USA, and above all to South America.
That is one of the reasons why Hezbollah started developing relations with organized crime, because its network of supporters around the world could actually be leveraged to provide a service to organized crime.
In 2019, a Lebanese man was arrested in South America on suspicion of money laundering.
The criminals need not only to launder the cash, but also to move the merchandise. And they provide that service too.
For years, U.S. authorities have been cracking down on Hezbollah's money launderers. In 2019, one of the leaders was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Others are still awaiting trial. Hezbollah maintains contacts with expatriate Lebanese almost everywhere in the world, a global network of organized crime.
Hezbollah is like the Amazon, DHL, and Western Union of the criminal underworld.
This video shows a raid in Europe. Fighting transnational criminal syndicates is getting more complicated for Europol, the European police agency headquartered in The Hague.
Organized crime is no longer based on groups, it's based on networks. They are using also these service providers, people who are experts on IT issues, financial issues, legal issues, logistical issues. They try to minimize their risks and then, of course, also minimize the costs.
Cooperation is highly interlinked. Alliances can change overnight, and borders are no longer much of an issue. Europol itself is a long way from being that flexible.
When I started to work here in Europol, the view on organized crime has completely changed. So it's a much more difficult situation than I expected, to be honest.
Europol regularly publishes videos of operations around Europe. They break up group after group, arrest dealer after dealer. New criminals simply spring up in their place.
Whenever there is an empty place, somebody will fill it in a really short time period.
Often only the small fish are caught. Without bankers and lawyers in the background, the business wouldn't function.
That's why you have to focus on those who are leading the criminal activities and not on those persons who are operating at the street level.
Easier said than done. Case in point, the Netherlands. In September 2019, Dutch lawyer Dirk Wilschum was shot. He was representing a key witness who wanted to testify against Moroccan drug smugglers. And 18 months later, journalist Peter de Vries was murdered in Amsterdam. He was advising the same key witnesses. The orders for the killings came from high up in the cocaine trade.
We should acknowledge that organized crime is posing an increasing and diverse risk for the EU member states and societies as a whole. We have to take action now before it's too late.
At Düsseldorf's higher regional court, an explosive trial depicts the new normal. Members of the mafia are alleged to have lent money to Turkish defendants for a cocaine deal with Moroccan traffickers. The public prosecutor has evidence from undercover officers. The dealers at the end of the chain earned 5,000 euros per kilo. All this is part of an international shadow economy that the German justice system can hardly touch.
I can't think of any way we could have really dealt a blow against organized crime, because even talking about it would be proof enough that we were furthering our own political goals.
For decades, criminal clans like the Italian 'Ndrangheta have succeeded in building structures in Germany. Sandro Mattioli researches how the Calabrian group has succeeded in Germany. Mattioli has read thousands of pages of files on the 'Ndrangheta from Italian authorities. The mafiosi were overheard praising Germany, saying anything was possible there. To keep it that way, they said it was important to be quiet like in Chiesa, in church.
They know exactly where they can work without attracting attention or having to fear consequences. The problem is that that realm is just too big.
In the city center of Duisburg, directly opposite the district court, mobsters spent years quietly laundering money through an ice cream parlor.
10 years ago, when I started looking at the mafia, I always thought it was impossible to know who belonged to the organization. Now it's clear that the police know a lot in terms of affiliations. They know exactly who moves in what circles. But there are no further consequences.
In Baden-Württemberg, restaurateur Mario L. became a respected person.
It was clear to every investigator who dealt with him that he was in the mafia. He opened one restaurant after another, and probably many more through frontmen. In the Italian files, the number is over 140.
Mario L. organized catering for the center-right CDU party and met future European Commissioner Günther Oettinger. After years without facing justice, he was sentenced to 10 years by an Italian court in 2019. Since the beginning of 2021, the largest mafia trial in years has been taking place in Calabria, with 355 defendants and hundreds of defense lawyers. Prosecutors want to expose the overall structure. In Germany, that sort of trial is a long way off.
If we don't even make the effort to recognize this system, to shine a light on it and understand it, then we won't be able to fight it with any precision.
For years, Italian prosecutors like Nicola Gratteri have been trying to take on the 'Ndrangheta. He carried out a spectacular anti-mafia operation named Metropolis back in 2013. At the time, Italian investigators uncovered a link to Irish extremists. An ex-member of the Provisional IRA was arrested.
In the Operation Metropolis, the paramilitaries had huge amounts or stockpiles of cash that they wanted to invest. So the mafia basically said, well, we can help you clean that money and invest it into a legitimate business.
The mafia developed land, building luxury apartments. When necessary, they put pressure on the previous owners. The mafia helped launder 450 million euros, with this supposedly former Provisional IRA member pouring money into property in Calabria. The key figure in the money laundering plot was jailed for years in the 1970s after being convicted of involvement in an IRA bombing. Brexit has shown how volatile the situation in Northern Ireland still is.
Most of Northern Ireland is actually run by paramilitary groups. There are certain parts of Northern Ireland that the police just can't police. They're not allowed to enter. And the message they get from local communities is, we're governed by paramilitaries. And
even in England, the police can't be everywhere. Unnoticed, Hezbollah was using a London warehouse to store thousands of cooling pads filled with ammonium nitrate.
Ammonium nitrate is used mainly as a fertilizer. It also is found commonly in small quantities in medical equipment.
The chemical's lethal capability was shown in the summer of 2020 in Beirut. 500 tons exploded in the port, destroying part of the city.
You can't just walk into a pharmacy and buy 3 tons of ammonium nitrate that were found in London. That's where these support networks around the globe come handy. You buy ice packs, first aid kits, and you slowly accumulate them over time in warehouses. And then at some point, the quantity is enough to enable the bomb makers to come in.
In 1995, U.S. terrorists used ammonium nitrate to blow up a federal building in Oklahoma. It's a substance that alarms investigators. In Germany, too, Hezbollah has set up an organizational structure and stored ammonium nitrate. In spring 2020, Hezbollah was banned in Germany, but it continues to operate illegally.
Hezbollah plays the long game. They are patient, much like Al-Qaeda, and are likely going to take their time to pick and choose their spots where they feel like they can have maximum impact. At the end of the day, their raison d'etre, right, is terrorism.
Just like drug cartels, terrorist groups like Hezbollah need to launder their money and move it around the world. Often major financial centers are used. In London, former finance watchdog and banker Graham Barrows has seen the practice close up.
London is a kind of perfect storm of a legal system which is useful, corporate structures which are useful. It provides a lot of the tools with which to launder money. So companies, for example, that exist solely to move money around the world.
80% of global trade is done in dollars, so a few large banks play a key role. Only they have license to inject dollars into the financial system. One of them is Deutsche Bank,
which have since become notorious for the levels of dirty money that's moved through them. It will then move through Deutsche Bank to all the safe places they want it to be.
Lebanon's FBME Bank was one such client. In July 2020, New York's banking regulator determined that it and Deutsche Bank had pumped $618 billion into the financial market. Much of the money can be traced to terrorist groups and drug cartels.
There genuinely is a global network of companies, banks and operators who will provide those services to anyone operating in the criminal economy, whether that's through corruption, organised crime, or the financing of terrorism.
The financial crisis exposed why many financial authorities only half-heartedly challenge the system. The global economy has long been too dependent on dirty money.
The head of the UN ODC, the Office on Drugs and Crime, effectively said the only thing that stopped the global economy collapsing was the dirty money entering the system. And that's as good a clue as you're ever going to get how important dirty money is to the global economy.
That dependence continued after the financial crisis. Up to 3 trillion euros are generated illegally every year. That's close to the gross domestic product of Germany and about 3% of global GDP.
Now imagine if we wipe 3% of global economic activity out tomorrow, we would have the worst depression the world has ever seen. It would collapse the global economy. So there is this kind of interlink between criminal activity and economic activity, which you can't wipe out instantly.
Prague, in the Czech Republic. Like neighboring Slovakia, the EU state is thought to suffer from widespread organized crime. In 2017, Czech journalist Pavla Holcová and her Slovak colleague Jan Kuciak began researching the Ndrangheta's influence on the government.
Jano called me one day that the Prime Minister has a new assistant. She's really young, she's former Miss Universe contestant, and there's no public information what made her eligible for such a position. We started to dig a little bit deeper, and we found out that she was co-sharing a company with Antonino Vadala, who was based in Calabria, and that he might have ties to Ndrangheta.
Jan Kuciak was 27 at the time, working from home as an investigative journalist.
Jan was really much more into documents, analyzing them, than talking to undisclosed sources. He was this kind of silent analytical type, putting it piece by piece together to understand the whole picture. We understood, both of us, that it could be tricky, but we thought that we might be facing risk from Italy. So we were kind of more careful if we are being followed or not. But we believe that there will be not much impact of the story. No one really paid attention to hardcore organized crime in Slovakia by then.
On February 21st, 2018, in the middle of the night, a former soldier entered Kuciak's house, shooting the journalist dead. Kuciak's 27-year-old fiancée, Martina, was also killed. When it became known that Kuciak had been researching possible crimes among the Prime Minister's entourage, thousands demonstrated against corruption. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico went on the offensive, offering €1 million as a cash reward for clues. But the questions remained unanswered.
After Jano was killed, of course, we took over and we actually tried to finish the work Jano started and was never able to finish.
Holcová was temporarily under police protection, but she continued to follow Kuciak's leads. The reporter had been investigating Marian Kočner, a well-known businessman in Slovakia. Kočner had allegedly evaded millions of euros in taxes. One day, Kočner had called Kuciak.
He recorded how the businessman was telling him, I'm going to collect dirt on you and your family and you will stop writing.
Kočner came under pressure. Kuciak's killer and his assistant were arrested, leading investigators towards the businessman. Eventually, Kočner was brought to trial as the alleged mastermind of the murder. His activities were probed by the court and by journalists.
One of the key pieces of the evidence were 2 cell phones of Marian Kočner. One of the cell phones contained a backup of 3 messages, and the conversation actually revealed his conversations with judges, with prosecutors.
This was proof that Kočner had bribed politicians and judges. One judge had been intimidated by one of his associates.
He sent this message, and it was actually saying she should do what she promised and she should rule, otherwise she might end up as Kuciak.
Holcová published the reports, prompting a shockwave.
21 judges were actually detained. It was massive, and I don't remember this happening in any other European country.
The former police chief, who was still investigating the Kuciak case, was also arrested on suspicion of corruption.
They were charged with heading organized criminal groups, what is like mind-blowing.
In the Kuciak murder trial, Marian Kočner was initially acquitted. It was a shock for the families of the victims. Then, in the spring of 2021, the Supreme Court ordered a new trial, a sign of Slovakia's constant struggle against organized crime.
By his decision to kill a journalist, Marian Kočner actually destroyed the whole system that was in place for 12 years. And before the murder happened, we could hardly imagine that the system would ever change. It was so much embedded in the society.
When the small island nation of Malta joined the EU in 2004, a lot changed for its 500,000 inhabitants. It also became a gateway for criminals into the EU. Reporter Daphne Caruana Galizia was interested in the issue, as her sister tells us.
She actually covered politics in Malta, and that led her to discover crime which was actually transnational.
The last sentence her sister wrote was, "There are crooks everywhere you look." The situation is desperate.
It does feel desperate at times because it feels like the criminals are winning.
Daphne Caruana Galizia had been intimidated and threatened for years.
She had become isolated by the end of her life. You know, there was such a long drawn out and such an intense campaign against her. You know, legitimized socially to the point that people could crack jokes about murder and witches and bombs. It's what we all said privately when Daphne was killed. It was shocking, but it wasn't surprising.
Hitmen shadowed the journalist and blew her up along with her car.
Because if you report one story after another and nothing happens, you become the last line of defense between the rule of law and its collapse. And it becomes very easy to take the person out. And this is what happened in Daphne's case.
After the murder, Maltese police took action against the criminal structures, arresting the perpetrators. Just like in Slovakia, the trail led to the ruling party. That caused protests.
You are blocking journalists' access to a protest demanding justice for a murdered journalist. A journalist murder.
They underestimated who they killed. In the end, that's what it's about.
The man suspected of ordering the killing was arrested in late 2019 while trying to flee on his yacht. 4 years after the murder, there's still no verdict in the case. The victim's family continues to fight for justice. Meanwhile, the European Parliament has named a press room after Daphne Caruana Galizia.
If you just back down, what you're saying is, yes, you were right. She didn't matter, you could kill her and get rid of her. They're not going to get that. If we set out to say, okay, we're going to solve organized crime globally, it's not going to happen. But you don't set out to win a war. You just set out to deal with the things you can do. It's the accumulation of all the small actions that will make the big difference.
Organized crime is a global problem, and to have any chance of defeating it, those fighting for justice must think globally too.